Welcome to the Great Coaches Podcast.
To me, being perfect is not about that scoreboard out there.
This is a chance of a lifetime.
When you can understand the person, you can then work towards a common goal.
We are all on the same team.
Know your role and do it to the best of your ability.
Focus on the fundamentals. We've gone over time and time again.
Your defense has got to be better.
Leave no doubt tonight.
Great moments are born from great opportunity.
Hello and welcome to the Great Coaches Podcast, where we believe that there is no algorithm for leadership, and so we interview great sports coaches from around the world to try and find ideas to help all of us be better leaders. Our great coach on this episode is Mike Thibault. Mike is an American basketball coach. He started his career as a scout with the LA Lakers in 1978, eventually becoming an assistant coach. He was working with the team in 1980 when they won the NBA championship. He then moved to the Chicago Bulls, where he worked as a director of scouting and assistant coach, and was in the room when the Bulls chose Michael Jordan in the draft. He has gone on to work with the Atlanta Hawks, the New York Knicks, the Seattle SuperSonics, the Milwaukee Bucks, and the Connecticut Sun, as well as being a part of the basketball staff for the USA women's team that won the Olympic gold medal in 2008. He was most recently the head coach of the Washington Mystics in the WNBA and led them to the 2019 championship. This is a masterclass of an interview, and some of the key takeaways for me were how honesty is the number one attribute that a coach at any level needs, and how as a leader you need to be bringing in people to be honest with you. How his time working at the LA Lakers when Magic Johnson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar were there taught him that it's never about you as the coach, but instead how well the team work together. How your priority should be getting better at your current job, not looking for your next job. And he talks about how he had to learn this early in his career, and the importance of emotional control, even if it is something that you are not particularly good at. We were very lucky to get this interview with Mike, and I hope you enjoyed as much as we did. And just before we go to the interview, if you like what we do here at the Great Coaches Podcast, then head over to our website where you can find exclusive audio and video content, as well as our insights database that has thousands of 1 to 2 minute videos from all of the great coaches we have interviewed talking about leadership topics like culture, communication and care. You can download the material and share it, and hopefully bring a different perspective to the challenges that your team is facing. And you can find all of that at thegreatcoachespodcast.com. And now, please enjoy our interview with Mike Thibault.
You're listening to the Great Coaches Podcast.
Well, good afternoon, Mike Thibault, or rather good morning your time, and welcome to the Great Coaches Podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Mike, very excited to talk to you about all things basketball today. I can see you've got the USA shirt on and you're about to head off to camp. So I appreciate you giving us a little bit of your time before you head off.
About 24 hours I'll be on that flight. So,
well, can I start with something really simple then to get us going? Where are you today in the world? What have you been up to so far, and where's that flight headed to?
I am in Washington, D.C., where I live year-round now. I'm actually in Virginia, across the river from Washington, D.C. We're a couple weeks removed from a unsatisfying finish to our season, because there's only going to be one satisfied team at the end. We lost in the playoffs to Seattle. They were better than us when it counted. We had our chance in game one and didn't get it done. So now I am preparing for USA Basketball starts training camp tomorrow night in Las Vegas for the World Cup in Australia. So that a place near and dear to you. So we're headed to Sydney in about a week, but we will be in Las Vegas training this next week. I've got to take a little delay for a day in the training at the end of the week. The Hall of Fame ceremony is next weekend, and one of my former players, Lindsay Whalen, is being inducted, and one of my former assistant coaches, Marianne Stanley, is being inducted as a coach and a former player. So It's a very busy and exciting basketball week. I'm glad I have USA basketball this week to kind of get over the end of our season, but a lot to look forward to the next month.
Well, it is, and the weather in Australia will be fantastic. And the crowds, well, they should be pretty vocal cheering for the home team.
I would think so. And they got the big return of Lauren Jackson coming back to their team. So a lot of people excited in Australia about what their team is going to look like.
So, Mike, maybe I could start actually. I know you're heading off to the Hall of Fame, but when I was learning about you, the list of coaches that you have had first-hand experience to is quite extensive. I can see Ann Donovan, Paul Westhead, George Karl, of course, John Wooden, and I'm sure there's many, many others. And I'd like to maybe just start by asking you, from your long and storied career up close with these great coaches, what is it you think that they do differently that sets them apart?
I don't. Differently is a tough word because there's so many great coaches. They all have a little bit different styles. But I think the first thing that always jumps out to me, and it's what I tell young coaches too, is that you have to be yourself. And I think that all of these coaches, sometimes through trial and error, trying to figure out things, is they have to identify their own personality that they are true to before you can be consistent with your players. And I think that's, there's principles that each coach has, and they're all a little bit different. But, I'll give you a different example. Paul Westhead was a person who fully believed in transition fast break basketball, and he hung his hat on it. And, he knew that there would be criticism at times of, how he played, or you should do this, you should do that. He knew what he was comfortable with and how he wanted to teach. And so he stuck to his principles. And so he could change up, with maybe a little bit different personnel, and, tinkered with it as he went along in his career. But that's who he was. John Wooden was a kind of back to basics fundamentals coach, and he believed in certain things. And so he developed his UCLA high post offense, and he based most of what he did around that. And he had principles, and his players had to, work fundamentally every day in the basics of that offense in order to be consistent. But I think they all had an authenticity about them that they just, when they got up in the morning, they were going to be the same person they were the day before, as far as showing a consistent face to their players. A lot of varying different personalities, some more lighthearted, some more serious, but they got comfortable in their own skin.
Mike, I've got this great quote from you. I'd like to read it to you actually before I ask the question. And you say, I go back to where I first started coaching. I was coaching high school sophomores. We won a championship, but I was just as happy for those players as I was for our Mystics players. Because players on any team go through the same kind of ups and downs in a season. And I think as a coach, you're a teacher, you're a father, you're whatever. And it was the last part of that quote that really caught my eye. And I wanted to ask you, in the context of where you are today with the Mystics, what is the role of a coach?
I don't think it's changed. I think that, times have changed, social media has changed things, players change, but you're a teacher first, or a mentor. And, I think the really good coaches, and this goes back to your first question too, is that the games are all great. The fans see the games, but the joy of coaching comes in the day-to-day grind of teaching and watching a player develop a new skill or improve something that they've had, or you see that kind of light bulb go on where they've grasped a concept that's been, hard to get. And I think, just like a teacher in a classroom or a music instructor or, a mentor in any other field, you want to see that light go on for somebody or make a leap. And I think that is where the true joy of coaching comes from. The wins are nice, and they are the final exam a lot of times, but it's in the work that goes into, The average person isn't going to see that musician who plays the piano sit in front of that piano for 6 hours at a time and go over and over the same scales. That same basketball player who's shooting 100 free throws at a time and 100 3-point shots and 100 layups in a day just to improve their skill. And so when you see breakthroughs for players or see them get better over a period of time, I think that's a part of it. And then the other part of the coaching, and everybody, it's a cliche about talking about the journey, to enjoy the journey as much as the result. But I think that's so true. A good team is like a family, and you have to have this camaraderie, and you have to have this "we're in this together" feeling that also people don't see as a general rule. They see the hugging on a court, when a big play happens, the high fives or whatever it is. But it's the day-to-day grind of getting through things, and the journey you take, whether it's in the airport together or going to practice on the bus or those kinds of things. That's all part of that experience too. And you're the band leader when you're going through that. And I said this to a team, gosh, when I was in Connecticut, and I said this 17 or 18 years ago. And one of my players asked in front of the team, like, when you look back on all this someday, what will be important to you? And I said, I hope that someday the experience you have when you're older and you got kids or whatever, you're sitting on your back porch one day and you say, I remember that experience, and it gives me a warm feeling. And I can look back and say it was a great thing. So about 5 years ago, I got a phone call from a former player who played in Connecticut. And she said to me, "Coach, I'm sitting on my back porch right now, and I'm having that moment you talked about." And she said, "I just was remembering all the fun that group had as we were going through that season." She said, "I thought I didn't need to call and tell you that." And that really made my day, week, month, whatever you want to call it at that time, because, then that maybe you're making a difference beyond just the X's and O's of the game.
Mike, I know that one of your team rules is to try and have something to laugh at every day, and you're quite overt about it. But why? Was there an event that sort of taught you about the joy of laughter within a team?
It was more observing other players, teams, coaches who I thought looked miserable. And it wasn't just they looked miserable that day, but as a general rule, that they were losing the reason that they picked up a basketball in the first place. This is a kid's game that, most people who play it, at our level, picked it up on the playground or in a gym or in their driveway when they were young. And it was the joy of the repetition of bouncing the ball and shooting it and hanging out with your teammates or playing pickup on a Saturday morning or doing all those things. And so the joy has to be there for just the game itself. It can't just be because you get paid to do it. And part of that joy is enjoying what you're doing every day. And, you have to have seriousness is to be good, but you also have to have a time and place for, making fun of yourselves. You make mistakes. Some of them they're just funny. Plays that happen or things that go on. And so I don't do it the same now, but I've had teams where I thought they were overly serious. And I literally used to have different players. I told them, you got to come with a joke to start practice tomorrow. Or I've had practical jokers on my team that were good at diffusing tense moments at the right time. Or players and coaches, you need to be able to poke fun, be the or poke up. I just think that's part of things on an even keel, and it keeps things real every day. I mean, we're not inventing the wheel or curing cancer. We're playing basketball.
Mike, in 1989, you become the head coach and GM of the Omaha Racers. Now, I imagine at the time this dual leadership role must have led to a lot of learning through, as you pointed out earlier on, trial and error. But how did that first experience back with Omaha, how did that change your approach to leadership?
I'll back up one step from that. I actually spent 1 year in Calgary shortly right before that in a league called the World Basketball League. It was for 6'4" and under players, and I had to do the same thing there. So that gave me a year preparation for Omaha. But what Omaha did for me, I was there 8 years, and I actually ended up becoming president of the team at one point, and so I was in charge of business, and I learned a whole bunch of things. I learned a lot more patience. I learned time management. And, I had young kids at the time, and probably that was one of our more difficult times as a family because I couldn't turn it off as a general rule, because you'd come home and there would be calls from the business side, or what do you think about this marketing promotion? And then you're, in the CBA at those times, which is, for fans that don't know, it's the G League now. And you had players going up and down to the NBA, and you were looking at roster every week. You were adding or subtracting a player. And so I learned, to roll with the punches. I learned you can't control everything as much as you like to think you can. I learned to manage my time because I had to. My family still needed me. My wife was terrific about, dealing with some things that, normally both parents would deal with at the same time. And we kind of figured out as we did that, how we're going to make this work long term. And then I also used that time there as kind of an experimental lab for how you run a team, how you coach. I got a chance during that time there. You weren't in front of, 10,000 people every night. You were playing in front of 3,000 or 4,000, and you had players coming and going. And so I learned how to be flexible. I learned that I could experiment, and I wasn't going to get critiqued every day by 15 media people. We had our one beat writer that followed us, and, a couple local TV stations, but I could try to figure out who I was as a coach. And then the GM part of it, I could learn more about how you put a team together, how pieces fit. You're not doing fantasy sports, where you're just going on stats. You got to have chemistry. You got to make players, fit the puzzle with each other. And so I learned a lot about team dynamics and how you, even though you may have a more talented player, they don't fit that group. And so, in the CBA and the G League, there's a lot of trades and there's a lot of movements. I had a lot of time there where, because guys got called up to the NBA the day before, I had 7 players at practice. I learned a lot of 3-on-3 and 4-on-4 drills to sustain it. And I also learned that, for good and bad. I mean, I only had one assistant coach and a trainer. It's not like the staffs we have nowadays. So I was doing a lot of the jobs that an assistant coach would do, as well as be the head coach. But I also appreciated that even more because when I had a chance to have a bigger staff, I knew how to, sort out roles to take pressure off not only me, but off of each other and share the work a little bit. So it was a daily learning process.
So there's Omaha, and then there's a few other organizations you've been involved with. I might just read off the list here. LA Lakers, Chicago Bulls, Atlanta Hawks, New York Knicks, Seattle SuperSonics, the Milwaukee Bucks, the Connecticut Sun. I mean, Mike, it's such an impressive list of organizations that you've seen up close. And so when you sit back and you think about these wonderful organizations, these world famous organizations you've been lucky enough to work with, what have you identified as the building blocks of high performing organizations?
I think, and I've kind of alluded to it before, but it's an organizational thing as much as it is a coach too. I think that you have to know who you are, kind of what you stand for day-to-day principles, of that group. It's funny. I'm a coach that gets roped into rebuilds or reconstructs of organizations. And so I walked into a Lakers organization as a scout first and then an assistant coach who had a good identity about winning, but they hadn't gotten over the hump. I mean, we had Kareem, we had Norm Nixon and others, but until we got Magic Johnson, that we couldn't reach the ultimate goal of winning championships. And so the first lesson is, as a coach, don't think it's about you. You have to have great players to win. And one or two might not be enough. You have to have great players, and they have to fit together, and they have to be willing to share the spotlight and share the load and the accolades and everything else that go with it. And Magic was a facilitator for everybody in that regard. He could make Kareem feel happy about playing each day. And so you need great players, and they also have to be the hardest workers. So that's one of the things about an organization, is that it's not about the coach, it's not about the GM, it's not about the owner of the team. It's about, it's a players' league. You need good coaches. You need all those people to fit, but it has to be everybody and understanding what it takes to win at the highest level. And so the Lakers figured that out. When I went from there to the Bulls, I went to basically an organization that was just trying to turn it around and figure it out. They had been bad for a couple of years, and yet they had a good coach in Jerry Sloan, who they didn't have enough good players. So Jerry Sloan got fired, and Paul Westhead got the job, and I went with him. And my job was to come in. And one of the reasons the job intrigued me was it was a chance to make a name for a team and for myself as a young coach and talent evaluator. I came in as a coach and director of player personnel, was to build this thing, from what had not been very good. And so, I looked at some of our Laker principles, but the first obvious thing to me is Jerry Sloan might have been the coach of the year and only won 30 out of 80 games because he didn't have talent. And so the very simple thing is you need talent. And so part of my job was to go about reconstructing that. So, learning from organizations is there are ways to spend money, there are philosophies, but if you don't have great players, it doesn't matter. You could have the greatest coach in the world. Jerry Sloan won Coach of the Year a lot more times when he coached in Utah, but he had Karl Malone and John Stockton. And he'll be the first to tell you that, great players. And so we had to rebuild. I only spent a short amount of time with Atlanta and New York, more on the player personnel scouting side of it. But those were organizations that weren't very good at the time. They were trying to find an identity. And I wasn't there long enough to be a part of anything one way or the other, but I got a chance to observe what it takes to try to go get new talent. And so when I went to Milwaukee, we were in that same mode to some degree that we were in Chicago when I went, but we had a little more talent. They just hadn't learned how to win together. And George was really good at identifying, how to use individual players to the best of the group. And so, he designed what he did to fit the players or better players too. And so, when I went back to coaching my own teams in Connecticut and Washington, they were reclamation picks. And Connecticut was more talented when I took it than I was when I came to Washington. Not anywhere near the talent. But they hadn't learned how to win. So you had to install those basic principles of how you work together. Let's make use of the best players. Let's go get another player that facilitates. Connecticut's a great example that they had talent, but they had been mediocre. Well, then we add Lindsey Whalen to the mix, a young point guard, much like Magic in the sense of, makes everybody happy, makes their jobs easier on the court. All of a sudden, things change. You need that dynamic person to make it go. And, that's a really, it's a long-winded answer, but it's a very consistent, simple thing. Get great players who like each other, who love being on the court, and make the pieces fit together.
Mike, your wife Nancy says that, quote, you have a lot of empathy, but tend to be stoic and composed. And it made me wonder if there was a list, if I was to ask you to list out the most important attributes for a leader in the WNBA, based on your experience, what would be at the top of that list?
Yeah, and it wouldn't even just be the WNBA. I think it's consistent. The WNBA, I coach it no differently than I would in the NBA or college or high school or anything else. I think the first thing is to be honest with yourself and be honest with your players. Don't be afraid to tell the truth. Sometimes you have to, sugarcoat it a little bit, or your approach and how you say it. But players instinctively know if you're trying to con them. And I think that you need to be honest with them, honest with their skills and what you expect from them. I think you have to be honest with yourself about the level of play that you have, how good your players are. You need to do constant self-evaluation of your own personal things, of your staff, and of your organization in general. You just can't assume things are going on. Going the same without reevaluating. I like bringing in people from the outside to, who are basketball people who watch my team and will tell me the truth. You guys stink at this, or you're good at this, or, I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is you need to be consistent. You ask your players to be consistent in your behavior or how they act with each other or how they act emotionally on the court. You have to be able to do that as a coach yourself. And I'm emotional at times. I think, my wife was being kind because I think I have a lot of passion. I have to learn how to rein it in sometimes. But your players also need to see that part of you too. I think that the stoic part comes in not overreacting to some things. But I think there's times you need to light a fire under people and make them understand that this particular thing as a coach matters to you. It's important, and that they need to see the same importance. And so I think, you have to balance it. And the other part of that is, you only have so many opportunities or times in a year where, you can kind of use that chip that you get somebody riled up and you get them going about. You can't do that every day, or it loses its impact probably on anything. I think you have to pick and choose your spots for the fire them up speech, or whatever it is that gets everybody going. I'm not a big believer in these rah pregame pep talks. Usually they happen 30 minutes before the game, and I found most players have forgotten them 10 minutes after you gave it. So, I think that your preparation for a game is in the work you've done. I don't think you can have a team that doesn't have emotion, but I think you also have to have a team that can play calmly when it's most needed. And so, you have to, I think as a coach, one of the things I've learned, you have to pick your spots. And tell the truth, be consistent, pick your spots, and know what you're doing. You're not going to be able to fake people. You do your homework. I think our players know, even from my staff, that my staff has put the time in watching film and studying that, if a coach on my staff talks to a player about something, the player goes, okay, they've done their homework. I think that's important.
Well, can I talk about spots, preparation, and lighting a fire, actually? Because in 2019, your team wins the WNBA championship. But the road to that victory started much earlier. In fact, I understand it was the pain of missing out in 2018 in Seattle that drove that team. I'd really like to know, Mike, what did you learn about motivation through that period?
I think almost every player that makes it to this level is, for the most part, highly driven. They're obviously talented, or they don't get to this level. They've been competitive to get to this level, but there sometimes is this understanding that needs to come of how hard it is. There's that saying that, if it was easy, everybody would do it. It's the true thing when you think you've played really hard, or you think you've worked on things, and you come up short and you say, shoulda, coulda, woulda. I could have been a little bit better at this. I could have done that. And actually in 2017, we lost in the semifinals to Minnesota, who won the championship. And then we got swept by Seattle, as you said. And our players knew there were a couple parts to that. Number one, we didn't have home court advantage. And that would have been nice in both of those years. And so the difference in home court advantage sometimes over the course of a season is 1 or 2 games. And did you let something slip away that you could have halfway through your season, and at the end of the year you regret it? I think the other part is you need something when you go through the offseason. And our offseason is really long. We're not playing this 80-game NBA schedule. We're playing 36 games or 34 games back then. And so, in that long off season, when you're thinking about, the shoulda, coulda, wouldas, are you going to be able to push yourself through to do the little extra to become a little better? Are you going to go from being a 79% free throw shooter to an 84% free throw shooter? And what does that look like? Am I going to be able to finish around the basket a little bit more with my offhand when the game is on the line? I'm getting jumped, jostled and bumped and everything else in traffic. Am I going to be able to finish that play? And so our whole thing was, can you be just a couple possessions better a game? Because if you can, and each person is, collectively that adds up quickly. And so our motivation was that each person's going to be a little bit better. You're probably not going to be 20% better or 15% better as a player. Maybe if you're young, but can you get one skill better? Can you be a little bit better at this? And if you all commit to that, then we'll be better. And we did that. We were better. It's ironic that, I mentioned free throw shooting. I wasn't thinking about it specifically when I first said it to you, but, we set an all-time professional basketball record, male, female, NBA, whatever, that year as a free throw shooting team. We shot 87% from the line. And it won some of those games at the end of games during the season that we did not win the year before. And they prided themselves on that. And they, competed with each other with those kinds of things. And so I think that had a lot to do with, the daily grind that I'm going to be a little bit better. And it paid off.
Mike, there's this theme that runs through your career. And you embrace change, but in service of your own personal development. You move, but then you stay put for multiple years and you evolve and you take in learning and you seem to roll it forward into your next role. And I'm wondering what advice you would now have for younger coaches when it comes to their own personal development.
I've thought about that a lot. I think the first thing is you can't spend your life as a coach always looking for your next job. That one thing that's a little better. I see it a lot in young assistant coaches in college. They're out recruiting, they're doing this, trying to get ahead, but they're always networking. They're always, networking is nice, but they're always trying to think, where my next job is. That could be in the back of your mind, but that can't be your priority. Your priority should be, how do I get better at my current job? How do I help this group better? How do I make me better as a coach? Do I need to study more? Do I need to look at new ideas? Am I going to be open to new ideas? What can I learn from this coach on this other team that I'm scouting? We're getting ready to play them. What can I learn from them? And so my biggest thing is don't be in a rush. And I got caught. That was the biggest dilemma for me about leaving LA to go to Chicago. I had to make sure I was doing it for the right reasons. And because I could have stayed in LA for a long time, probably, and we'd have kept winning. But I had advice about going to learn a little bit more and kind of prove myself in a bad situation where I'd learn from it and maybe people would pay attention. But that's the one time I think probably I left thinking about my next job. And I didn't make a mistake, but it kind of reminded me, I got to know why I'm doing this. I think, we live in a society to now where it's instant gratification. We get judged. I mean, you see, the WNBA I've been in the WNBA now 20 years. And for about 15 or 16 years, every single offseason, I was asked, is the WNBA going to survive? And, are you going to be out of business? And it was one of those things that my answer was, well, people ask the NBA that every year that they went through and all the franchise changes. And, a lot of people nowadays don't remember the Fort Wayne Pistons that are now the Detroit Pistons, or the Buffalo Braves that became the LA Clippers or the San Diego Clippers that became the LA Clippers. So if everybody had judged the NBA on its first 15 or 10 years, they would have been out of business. And yet it's the same thing individually about coaching. You're going to make some mistakes. You're going to move around a little bit, but don't be in a hurry to just judge what you're doing by the first result. Do you have patience to last a while? Coming here to DC, I took a job that the previous 2 years, they were 6-28 and 5-29. And, the first year we made a big jump. We won 17 games, and everybody goes, it's fixed, it's good. And I knew darn well we probably spoiled people because we had won more games than we really were as good as. We played harder than the previous group did. We played with more enthusiasm, but we weren't all that much more talented. And until we became more talented, until we fixed some other things, it wasn't going to pay off. And it didn't pay off until we added a couple great players. Back to my very first statement about great players. You need to have great players. Well, getting Elena Deladon and Christy Tolliver in an offseason, that changed us from being good to great. And so, I'm telling young coaches, it's not going to happen all at once. Patience, is a virtue that everybody's preached for their whole lives, but it's true. If you don't have the patience to see something through, then you're always going to be unhappy. I know coaches that they were always looking for the next thing, and I never saw them as contented or happy people. They couldn't live in that moment of enjoying what they were doing right then. And so that's my biggest advice for young coaches. And then the other part of it is be a sponge, be curious, be inquisitive, ask questions, watch other people, be observant, learn new ways to do things. I'm about to be 72 years old, and I can tell you I probably learned 5 or 6 new things in the last month that I would do a little bit differently, or I want to change this drill or do something. If you aren't willing to do that, and if you're set in your ways, you're not going to get better.
Mike, I understand it was your daughter who first said to you that we need more focus on women's basketball. The game's come a long way, as you just said, Dan, but I guess if it's to continue to grow, what would you point out as the main priorities for the coming decade?
Some are individual skill things, some are big picture. I think that on the individual side, players continuing to do what we seem to be doing right now. We're bigger, faster, stronger as athletes in the women's game right now. The average post player when I came in the league probably was 6'3", 6'4". We have all these 6'6", 6'7" players now who are athletic, can handle the ball. You have more versatility. You have, Elena Deladon and Brianna Stewart and Asia Wilson, Jonquil Jones, all these players who are 6'6", 6'5", who can shoot the three, they can post up, they can do all these things. Lauren Jackson in Australia is one of the first of that group. I think she helped change the game, but you got to keep evolving as a player. You can't let coaches when you're young put you in a box and just because you're big say, well, you're a back to the basket post player. I think, you need young players to develop as athletes as well as basketball players, jumping and sprinting and running and landing and all those things are going to be important to injury prevention, to body development. I think that's part of it. I think the next part of it is the players need to be students of the game and watch more of their own peers, of the NBA, of international play, and continue to learn new ways to get better, both as teams and coaches and players. And then the last part is a more global thing for the general public. We have a much more aligned acceptance of women's sports now than we did, but it's still not there. We're seeing TV programming take on more and spend more and pay more for the rights to women's sports. But that's going to be the difference. Everybody says, why can't we pay our players more? Well, we're not going to be able to pay them more until TV pays us more. And I think that that's the next big horizon that, has to be hurdled as far as the game. We need more parents to encourage their kids, whether they're boys or girls, to watch and appreciate women's sports, not just basketball, but women's sports in general. And I think we're seeing more of that. We're seeing more dads coaching their daughters. And, it used to be the old image of a father wanting to have a son and coach their son. You got a lot of dads now who are just as happy to coach their daughters and see their progress. And that's been a big change. But I find one other thing that's interesting out there. If women want to have more rights for women athletes and more appreciation for women's sports, women need to take up the mantle as much as anybody. It's interesting in the United States right now, 50% of the NFL football watching population is women. Can you imagine that would be what that would do for the WNBA? That we need moms and dads to take their kids to events, to not want free tickets, to pay for, to go to a game. Because, I think there's been this image out there is that, I'm willing to pay big dollars to go to an NBA game or an NFL game, but we trivialize the women's game if we're not willing to do the same thing. And that has stuck out to me on the business side more than anything else. If you're willing to spend, $14 or $15 to go to a movie, why are you looking for a ticket half that price to go to a pro women's basketball game or a college women's basketball game? You have to give it the same credence that you would something else. You cannot devalue the product. And I think that's, another step that we need to take. And I have those discussions with our fans when we do business of basketball thing. Fans are wanting, free this and free that, but you want our players to get paid more. Well, you can't have it both ways. There is a cost to doing business. And so, I think that that's a reality that needs to be addressed if we want women's professional sports to succeed. Because if it does succeed and it's on TV and it will trickle down to every level of women's sports. And I just feel that that's, somewhere we need to go with it.
Mike, you've been so generous with your time today. I know you're racing to catch a plane. So I've got one final question, and I'd like to start it with a quote, actually, because you say you prefer the individual success of a player than the coaching thing, end quote. And I guess in the distant future, if you ever retire, what would you like your legacy for these individuals to be?
Yeah, and I think that quote is I like the individual and the team as opposed to the legacy of your coach. I would like, kind of back to what I said early on, for players to look back and say, this coach had my best interest at heart. I learned how to be a better basketball player, but I also learned how to be a better adult, a human being. As I go through this, I want players to think beyond themselves, and I want an appreciation for what they've done. And so, I'm not the most religious person, but I'm a big believer that you treat others, the golden rule of treat others like you would want to be treated. And I want players to come away from an experience of being coached by me that I've lived up to that I want them to know that I had their best interests at heart, and that I cared, and that I'm going to enjoy talking to them and observing them 5 or 10 years after they're done playing. see what kind of parent they are, what kind of, wife or husband they are. I get a lot of enjoyment out of, seeing former players and how they're succeeding or what they're doing. But I want them to walk away from being coached by me or by my staff saying that was a great experience. That's what I would like. The wins and losses come because of that. And you're not going to always have the best. There's only one happy team at the end of every year in a league, the one that wins the championship, and not everybody's going to win it. But I do want them to say this was worthwhile.
Mike, I think enjoyment, treating others like you wanted to be treated, and worthwhile is a pretty good place to finish. So thank you so much for your time today. All the best in Australia. I hope that you come second. I really do.
I might not ever be coaching again if we come in second.
And I'll be watching on from afar, but I really appreciate your time today, Mike. Hi, everyone. You have been listening to the great coach, Mike Thibault. I hope you got a lot out of Mike's thoughts and found a couple of ideas that you can bring to your own locker room, boardroom, or dinner table for discussion. When I listened back, some of the other key highlights for me were how he worked at learning to manage his time early in his coaching career, and in parallel learning that he didn't have to control everything, and how these two things came together to help him have more balance in his family and work life. The importance of joy to him as a value, and how he tries to start each practice with a joke, how a good team is like a family and has a deep sense of camaraderie, and his advice to young coaches to just be themselves and not a different version of someone else. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. And just before we go, if you have any feedback, then please let us know. Just like Scotty H, who said, great interviews, wonderful insights from such a broad selection of people in sports. Thanks, Scotty. The interaction with the people around the world who listen gives us great energy. And so if you have any feedback or comments, please let us know. And if they're positive ones, then please let your friends and family know too. All the details on how to connect with us are in the show notes or on our website, thegreatcoachespodcast.com.